Okay, so there's a few that have read it and there are a few that have not. Okay, well, and that makes sense. Um, how many of you have received an offer when you're representing a seller that has included a buyer broker agreement and a seller to pay the buyer broker compensation? Is there anybody that's received that? I know there's a few because okay, so Matt has. Okay. So I think, as we get started with the class today, with this big change, is that there are already some people that are experimenting and some of the people that are out there that are using the documents that we're going to talk about today. They certainly have never been required before, um, but some people are using them. So I want to go through and sort of help everybody get a little bit more comfortable with the change that's coming soon. So I want to welcome all of you. If you can stick with showing me your smiling faces, that would be great. I'd rather see you than the black boxes as we're talking today. A couple of points that I want to make before we begin. Number one is to please read through the documents and take the time to understand them thoroughly. I really want to stress how important it is, not only, these documents that we're learning today, but, CAR, changes our documents, a couple of times a year. They make little changes to documents and, sometimes we're sitting across from a buyer or seller and they ask us a question and then we go to read the document, to answer their question and we don't even know what we're asking them to sign. So I think that's really sort of malpractice. We should not be doing that. So please read the documents and understand them thoroughly. I know that as I went through this buyer broker agreement with my team, a few weeks ago, I was unclear. I really had to read through the document to try and understand what it was that they were trying to teach us to do. So it's important to do that. Second thing that I would make as a point is to read it more than once. Even if you think you understand it, read it again just to make sure that you really clearly understand it. The last thing is I would challenge you to commit to being an authority and an expert on your craft, on the things that you're doing, and that you're asking your clients to sign, because there's a twofold benefit to that. One is that you will earn more money, and the second thing is you will earn the respect of your clients. They will start to look for you, at you as an authority. They will look to you for answers. One of the things that we've talked a lot about in our training, with our past clients and sphere of influence and working our database, is to provide valuable information to our clients so that they have a reason to talk with us. Well, if we don't understand the buyer broker agreement and the changes that are coming to our business, that does not enhance our professional reputation, I guess is the way that I would say that. Okay. More than simply giving all of you facts today and trying to explain to you how to fill out the form, I'm going to spend a little bit less time on telling you, what I think you should be doing and try to help you to understand what the purpose of the document is and the principles behind what the options are, how they work, and when things apply. Because if you thoroughly understand the documents that we're going to be discussing today, you will be able to fill it out in a way that honors the agreement that you and your client are trying to make, or the contract that you're trying to make with the seller for payment. Does that make sense? I don't want to tell you how to fill them out. I want to help you understand how it works, so that you are able to build the buyer relationship that you want to have with them and they fully understand. So a couple of points that I'm going to make. Um, Before we get started is the buyer broker agreement is now going to be required beginning on August 17th. That is the date that NAR has pushed it back to. So as of August 17th, 2024, when an agent or broker is, quote, working with a buyer for a residential property, 1 to 4 units, a buyer broker agreement is going to be required. So some of the questions that might raise for you is, what does working with a buyer mean? And what is the trigger that requires a buyer broker agreement to be actually signed? Okay. So a couple of things I'm going to share with you just briefly on this before we get started on the contracts themselves is that the definition of working with a buyer means that you're working with the buyer, that you're working in a representative capacity with the buyer on a transaction. That does not mean that you're talking with a buyer. You can talk with a buyer at an open house and not be working with them. You can be talking with a buyer that calls on a sign, or an internet lead, and you're not working with them. You don't need to have a buyer broker agreement to talk to a buyer or to market your services to a buyer. You have to have a buyer broker agreement when you're working with the buyer. And so the trigger for that is when you show property. The trigger for that is when you start to show property. And not only is it showing property to them in person, but if you go to videotape or do a live walkthrough preview on behalf of a buyer broker agreement would be required. Okay. So the trigger is when you're showing property is when it has to be in place. Working with the buyer means that in some capacity, you're representing the buyer and the buyer's interests, not just giving them information, working on behalf of a seller or working on behalf of yourself, trying to establish a relationship with them. Once you begin working on behalf of the buyer, that is when you are working with the buyer. The trigger is when you show property. As of August 17th, no offers of compensation can be made through the MLS on behalf of the seller. That does not mean offers of compensation can't be made. It just simply means that it can't be made through the MLS. So one last point that I'll make before I open it up for a couple of questions on this issue is the phrase ministerial act. That is something that the NAR legal group has included in their Q&A that we're going to send to you all after this class is over. And a ministerial act is things like setting appointments to look at properties, gathering CC&Rs, talking with different vendors about services for your client. Whenever you start working on behalf of your buyer, all the things that we do all the time, that's called a ministerial act. And so when you are doing ministerial acts on behalf of the buyer, that means you're working with them too, but the trigger is when you start to show them property. So technically, you could be working with a buyer doing ministerial acts, setting up appointments before you step foot inside a door, either with a video camera or with the buyer. You would have to have the buyer broker agreement in place. So I'm going to stop right now and ask, is there any questions on what we've talked about so far, or is everybody up to speed on that?
Are you going to be, I know you said you're not, but like going through the forms and I see some of the notes. Okay.
Yeah, I am going to go through that. So that's perfect. So we will send out the Q&A notes from NAR Council. That'll come out with you later. We're going to cover 4 forms today. The Broker Compensation Advisory Form, which is a brand new form. So let me share my screen, and I'm going to have all of you, hopefully, take notes as we go through here. Okay. Everybody see my screen? Okay, good. So this is a form that all of you have seen. It's basically 4 things to know about the new Broker Compensation Advisory Form. I think it was issued on May 9th, so that's sometime last week. It's talking about, what is the thing? It's basically a compensation advisory. How do brokers get paid? It's a really good document. We're going to sort of go through it line by line here in a second. It can be used when you're a listing agent explaining to the seller how you're paid and what the rules are. It also talks about how, buyer brokers are paid and, sort of what the options are that we're going to be using going forward. Okay. So I'm not going to necessarily go over that form. I'm going to go right into the document itself, which is the broker compensation advisory. This is this new form, and I think this is what we've sort of been waiting for the past few weeks. We knew that NAR and CAR were going to be working on documents to help guide us through this change, and I think this is the form that they have come up with that is going to be helpful for us. So as we go through here in section 1, this entire section here is talking about sellers and listing agreements and the commission structure. And so this is basically an advisory to sellers saying, hey, if you're a seller, this is how compensation works. So when a seller lists their property for sale through a real estate broker, they agree to pay the seller's broker, their own agent, when escrow closes. The seller may also authorize the seller's broker to share compensation with a buyer's broker, or may agree to directly pay the buyer's broker. Okay? So this is basically laying out in detail exactly what our sellers need to know. I mean, I've heard this a lot from people talking about this change, saying, oh my God, my seller doesn't want to pay the fee, da 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 da, and everything, everybody's talking about all of this other stuff. No, I mean, this form is really going to help us to explain, exactly to a seller what has to happen, okay? A listing agreement compensation is negotiable. It's always been negotiable. It could be 5%, it could be 6%, it could be 7%, it could be any percentage. It could be $500. It's always been negotiable. When a seller enters into a listing agreement with a broker, the seller authorizes the broker to find a buyer for the seller's property and agrees to pay the seller's broker if a buyer is found who is purchase the property. Compensation amounts are not fixed by law, but are instead negotiable between the seller and the seller's broker. There's really nothing new in this paragraph, is there? I mean, this is all standard stuff that we've known for years. Maybe our sellers knew it, maybe they didn't know it, but this paragraph really explains in detail how we're paid. It goes into, they're not fixed by law, but when negotiating the compensation amount, the parties may discuss factors such as the broker's expertise and experience, the type of broker services to be performed, the broker's time and expenses, among other considerations. If the seller approves, a listing agreement may authorize the seller's broker to share part of that broker's compensation with the broker who represents the buyer. That's the way it's worked for at least the last 38 years, 40 years that I've been in the business, okay? Let's see. And the amount the seller's broker agrees to pay, the buyer's broker will be incorporated into overall compensation. This is the way it's been. I take a 6% listing with the seller, and I offer to pay the buyer's broker 3%. That's the way it's always worked, okay? Well, now, in the new day and age with the new rule that we have, you're not required to offer anything through the MLS. You can still offer it, but you just can't do it through the MLS. So this paragraph is sort of new information to a seller. It says offering compensation to a buyer's broker is negotiable. It means you don't have to, and you can negotiate the amount. Sellers and sellers brokers are not required by law or otherwise to offer compensation to buyers' brokers. The promise of payment from the seller's broker to the buyer's broker may lead to a quicker or more efficient transaction because knowing the overall cost of broker compensation at the time of the listing allows a seller to more easily calculate the seller's net proceeds when evaluating offers and counteroffers. That's true. The seller's property may become more attractive to buyers who need a loan to finance the purchase price, since buyers who may have limited funds, many buyers have limited funds after paying a deposit, a down payment, property inspections, costs, and other costs for closing. These buyers may be more likely to write an offer for the seller's property if they are able to effectively finance the buyer broker compensation into the cost of their loan rather than coming up with additional funds. Does that sound like a lot of the things that we've been talking about for the last couple of months? I mean, we don't want to make this change because we know that this is how our industry has worked. Well, all we're doing with this advisory is CAR has given us a tool where we can explain. I love this phrase. A friend of mine shared it with me about 6, 7 years ago. He said this, being in real estate is like explaining the obvious to the unreasonable. I love that phrase. You know, being in real estate is explaining the obvious to the unreasonable. Everything that is in this advisory is for those unreasonable sellers out there to say, hey, look, you know, your home is going to be more attractive to buyers that have limited funds to pay their buyer broker. Do you want to have more buyers looking at your property or less? Of course, they want more. Okay. So we've got more attractive if you're offering the compensation. Offering compensation, this area here, offering compensation to a buyer's broker allows the seller to inform brokers representing prospective buyers that they can rely on the efficient payment of their compensation without adding to buyers' closing costs. So it's going to give some kind of comfort to a buyer that's trying to go through a stressful purchase to know that they're going to be able to finance their buyer broker fee into the cost of the purchase. Makes sense? That's the way it's always been. So that's great. Paragraph 2, buyer broker compensation agreements. Very new to us, but not very new for 19 or 20 states in the US that are already using them. So this paragraph, paragraph 2, talks about buyer broker compensation arrangements. In California, a buyer representative agreement is recommended and required in certain circumstances. I shared with you earlier is that when you're working with a buyer, it's required. The trigger is when you're showing property to them and it's residential property, 1 to 4 units. You guys have heard that phrase, TDS is required with a residential 1 to 4 units. A lot of our documents and disclosures are only required when it's residential 1 to 4 units. So what this advisory is saying here is that it's advisable all the time, but it's only required in sometimes residential 1 to 4 units. Okay. Recommended. Okay. Buyers and their brokers benefit when the terms of their relationship and respective duties are written because expressed written terms establish mutual expectations and help avoid misunderstandings over buyer and broker duties and the amount of compensation the buyer's agents expect to be paid. One of the notes that I wrote at the very end of the presentation, and I'll share it with you now, is that agreements prevent disagreements, right? Would everybody agree with that? Agreements prevent disagreements. How many times have we had a problem relationship with a client or another agent or somebody else? And when you say, well, what's the problem? And they say, well, I assumed that I would get paid more, or I assumed that you would do that for me. Or I expected that you would do that. Did I ever say that? No, I just expected it. Well, the whole purpose of this new change here and this new disclosure is to get rid of the disappointment of people assuming something. So agreements prevent disagreements, okay? And that's what that's saying there. Many sellers authorize their brokers to offer compensation to a buyer's broker in the listing agreement. This may be used to offset the obligation a buyer has under a buyer representation agreement. A buyer's broker should communicate with the buyer about how the broker will be paid for their work in representing the buyer. In the absence of a buyer representation agreement, if the compensation offered to the buyer's broker from third parties is insufficient to meet the expectations of the buyer's broker, and the buyer's broker is unable prior to drafting an offer on behalf of the buyer to reach an agreement with the seller or the seller's broker to be paid an amount the broker deems adequate, the buyer's broker is not obligated or obliged to represent the buyer. What does that mean? In layman's terms, it means that if the buyer doesn't enter a written agreement with me, wants me to represent them on the purchase of a home, and I can't get the seller or the listing broker to pay me a number, let's say that they say, well, I'll only pay you $5. And I say, well, I'm not willing to do that. If I don't have a buyer broker agreement that's representing that buyer, where they're promising to pay me and the seller or the third parties won't pay me what I'm willing to do, I don't have to represent that buyer. That's what that says, okay? So that's the first 2 paragraphs here. This last one here, 3, is talking about the methods for the buyer's broker to obtain their compensation. So I thought this was really good. The buyer can pay the compensation through a buyer's representation agreement. Buyer says, I'll pay you $10,000. They can write you a check and it's done with. A buyer's broker may negotiate the amount of compensation expected directly with the buyer, who may choose to simply pay their own agent. That's option one. The second option is that the seller pays the compensation. The buyer can negotiate for the seller to pay the buyer's obligation under a buyer representation agreement. A buyer may negotiate a term in the purchase agreement asking the seller to pay the obligation they have already agreed to pay their own agent in a buyer representation agreement. So the buyer says, Mark, I'll pay you 2.5%. They can negotiate at the time that they make the purchase, asking the seller to pay the 2.5% that they've already promised to pay me. So that's an option there. The buyer negotiates with the seller to pay the fee that they've already agreed to pay me. This option should be discussed when creating a buyer representation agreement and prior to an offer being made. Again, remember, agreements prevent disagreements. So if you have this conversation about the options up front, everybody will go into the negotiation with their eyes wide open. The next, buyer's agent negotiates an agreement directly with the seller. So this means that I can go directly to the seller and have them pay me. If a seller is unrepresented or does not have an exclusive agency relationship with another agent, a buyer's agent may approach the seller to obtain a single party compensation agreement where the seller agrees to pay the buyer's broker compensation without necessarily creating an agency relationship. So an example of this would be, is one of the promises that I make to my buyer with a 2.5% fee is that I'm going to search for unlisted properties that have either expired in the past, or they're for sale by owner, or they're properties in a neighborhood that I know that they're targeting. And so what I will do is I will say to them, I will look at things that are unlisted. And so I find something that is a for sale by owner that fits my buyer's needs. I can negotiate directly with the seller prior to showing my buyer that property that they will agree to pay the 2.5% based on the buyer broker fee that I have. And they'll tell me what price that they're willing to accept with that. I only see a few faces. Does that make sense to everybody?
Mhm.
Perfect. Okay. The next option here is the seller's agent pays the compensation to the buyer's agent. And so what I'm envisioning when I go through this paragraph here is that nothing changes, that we still go out and take 5% and 6% listings, and we work with our seller to pay 2.5% or 3% to the buyer's broker. Instead of offering it through the MLS, instead we communicate that to buyer's agents some other method. Basically we say, hey, yeah, we'll pay you 2.5% if you sell our house. Well, the seller's agent can pay the compensation to the buyer's agent out of the listing commission that I've already got in my listing agreement. So if I have 5% in there, I can allocate 2.5% to the buyer's agent, and I can pay the buyer's agent out of the fee that I've earned with my seller. Does that make sense to everybody?
Mhm.
Okay. Go ahead, Maureen, question.
Are we gonna get into, I'm sure we will, how we notify buyer's agents that there's being compensation authorized by the seller?
No, because I don't know the answer to that yet.
Okay, because I don't know, I mean,
I have
do
my
we make it in the comments on the MLS, or can it not be on the MLS at all?
the rule is pretty specific that buyer broker compensation cannot be offered through the MLS.
Okay.
However, we are allowed to make buyer concessions known through the MLS. For example, seller will offer a carpet allowance of $5,000, or the seller will pay buyer's loan discount points not to exceed, such and such. So we're able to offer buyer concessions through the MLS, but not buyer broker compensation. And I think that we haven't really worked that out yet. I think there's going to either be probably a field added to the MLS that says buyer concessions are available, contact the listing agent for details. I think there's going to be something along that line. But so that's what I think is going to happen. I don't know how else it's going to be offered, but you couldn't put it in the comments because that's in the MLS.
Hey,
You
Mark,
cannot,
Yes,
did you
Phil.
say you cannot put it in the comments?
I think you can put buyer concessions are available, but I don't think you can say buyer broker compensation is
Okay.
available. I think you can do that.
So that's something that's still up in the air, clearly.
Yes, at this point, yes.
Yeah.
Bill, go ahead.
Mark, on the RLA, does that mean that the sentence that says we'll share that compensation, does that mean that pair goes away in the RLA?
I don't think it's going to go away in the listing agreement. The RLA, for those that, that may not know, that is the residential listing agreement, has a paragraph that's in there that says, that you're going to offer, 2.5 or 3% compensation to the buyer's broker through the MLS. Well, they're clearly going to remove the through the MLS because you're not allowed to offer it through the MLS. That's what the rule change is. I really believe that the only thing that is going to change with that is that they're going to just remove the phrase from the MLS, that you're still going to be able to take a 5 or 6% commission listing agreement. You're going to be able to offer 2.5 or 3% or whatever you choose to the buyer's broker. You just won't be able to do it through the MLS, and we will find different ways to do that.
Okay, it sounds like we can set up the seller then for being prepared to pay the buyer's agent.
Absolutely, and that's what I'm planning to do. That's what my team is planning to do.
Thank
And
you.
that's what I'm encouraging all of you to do, okay? If you guys, I can't see everybody, so if you have a question about this forum, jump in real quick. Otherwise, I'm going to go to the next forum.
Hey, Mark, I have a question.
Yep.
Do you think that they'll ever change the purchase agreement to add this information in there?
I don't think they're going to change the purchase agreement. What they have done in the purchase agreement, and I don't have that form here to talk about today, but they have a box that they've added to the purchase agreement that you check that says the buyer and the buyer's agent have entered a buyer broker agreement, and we want you to pay the fee. I mean, that box is already there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mark, I have a question too.
Okay.
Hey, Mark, do you think the new norm may become that whenever we get a listing and the seller is paying buyer's agent compensations, that we're just gonna be sending an email to all the agents in Big Bear and just letting everybody know that, okay, I just got a listing, this is gonna be the buyer's agent commission?
Yeah. I don't know if that's going to be standard practice. As I mentioned with Maureen, I don't know. When I started, one of the things that I shared when I started the class today is that I don't want to dictate or tell or require anybody to do things my way. I want you guys to understand how this works. One of the best things that we have as real estate people is that we're entrepreneurial. We are very, very creative. We find ways to make things work. We're problem solvers, okay? And so I think there's going to be a lot of different ways of experimenting with how you offer compensation to other people and how you do it. There will be people that come up with standard practices, but I can tell you also that the people that make the most money in our business are the ones that are creative, that do things out of the box, right? Those are the people that make the most amount of money. So we want to try and find the most efficient ways and the most innovative ways to conduct our business so that we can perform and compete better. Okay.
Mark, it's Becky.
Yep.
It's my understanding that over all these years, we've never had to pay out a buyer's agent if the seller didn't want to. It's few and far between, but I have had a seller not want to pay a buyer's agent, and I won't take that listing if that happens. But that is an optional box right there. And that's why we have the buyer broker agreement that nobody's ever wanted to use if something like that was to come up. So really, all of this isn't that big of a change. It's just we're not putting it in the MLS. And I think that's the hurdle that people need to get over in their head, that this has always been this way. It's just we've been able to, most sellers pay out. And I wouldn't take a listing if they didn't want to, honestly, because I think that's an uphill battle.
Okay, well, the only comment I will make on that is that under the old rules is that if a seller was unwilling to pay a buyer broker, you couldn't put the property in the MLS because one of the MLS rules and regs required you to offer compensation to the buyer's broker through the MLS. So, yeah, and I don't want to go any further on that one.
Could it be $5? Could they have just offered $5 to a buyer's agent if they wanted to?
They could have offered $5, yeah.
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 Thank you.
So, Mark, that is what my biggest concern is without naming names, there are agents in town that will entice a seller to go with them with the not being forthright in that they're still gonna have to pay the compensation. So seller's gonna be led to believe that with them, they won't have to pay as much commission. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well,
And they'll get the listing because of it, and then later on, all of a sudden, an offer comes with asking the seller to pay buyer broker compensation, and they're like, what the heck?
Yeah.
You know, so it's gonna be how people present it to the seller, and we all should still be basically saying business as usual. You're gonna have to pay someone who brings you a buyer. But like I said, fear that there'll be some agents just to get the listing will make it seem as though they're not gonna have to pay as much commission.
Yeah, but we have scripts for that. I
Okay.
mean, we have scripts for, we have listing agents that will tell you that they can get you $50,000 more than it's worth. Maureen, can I tell you what concerns me about that? As that agent, will tell you that they can get you $50,000 more so they can get your listing and then start beating you up on the price week after week after week after week. Is that what you want? No, I didn't think so. Here's the truth. Let's sign the contract and get the property. So we develop scripts for agents that don't do that job. The agent that says, well, I'll do it for 3% or I'll do it for 2%. I won't charge you 6%. Can I tell you what concerns me about that? An agent that's not upfront about their value obviously knows their value. If their value is that low and, they can't defend their own value to you, how are they going to defend you in your price when it comes to negotiating a sale? So we have all kinds of scripts that we are going to be able to implement, to overcome the agents that don't do a good job with this change. Okay.
Thank you.
Mark, I have a question linked to that, and then after that, I'll be done with questions. At what point do you become unethical? You know that in the business, when you're showing properties, a lot of buyers, they may seem like they have a whole plan. And then, of course, along the way, they change their prices. They want to see different properties. You have property recommendations for them to see. And then everything many times just happens on the spot in some occasions. At what point do you become unethical if, for instance, a property is, and once again, the time over here is of the essence, that stuff happens quickly, where a seller is offering either no compensation, that you already know that, or the seller is offering like $5, and you say, I'm not going to show you the property, or at what point do you become unethical? That's my question.
Well, number one, I don't think you ever become unethical. We never become unethical. That's a choice to never be unethical. And part of the reason for all of this, all of the change coming forth is that, the Department of Justice and the consumer advocates felt that agents were being unethical because they would show properties that the buyer's brokers were being offered 3% and they wouldn't show the properties that were being paid $5. That's the complaint. And so that's what a lot of this is about. It's about transparency. A lot of this is about transparency. A lot of this is about understanding how our compensation works, A lot of this is about understanding the value and the services that we provide to a buyer that the buyer actually wants to pay for, right? To create a win-win relationship with somebody that doesn't know what you're doing, okay? That's not ethical, I guess, is to, how do you have a win-win relationship with somebody when they don't know, what you're obligated to do or what their options are, okay? And so a lot of this is about transparency. So let's go into the buyer representation and agreement, that you guys see here. I don't think everybody has gone through it, but I'm going to go through it quickly because I really want you guys to understand, it's not that big of a deal. This paragraph here looks a lot like a listing agreement. It's an agreement, it has a start and an end date. It's between, the buyer and our company, or yourself. And it has a start date and it has an end date. Just like a listing agreement. It says, I'm your broker for the next 6 months. I'm your broker for the next 90 days. I'm your broker for the next year, whatever it is. The second paragraph here outlines that there's no other existing agreements, or if there are other existing agreements, that there's full transparency and an understanding of what that means. Now, I'll give you an example how there could be some other pre-existing agreements that are out there. Somebody might, for example, go online and find an agent online and say, hey, would you go videotape this house for me? And the agent says, well, if I videotape a house on your behalf representing you, I'm not the listing agent. If I do it for you, I need a buyer representation agreement. And the buyer says, well, I'll only sign you a buyer representation agreement for this property that you're going to do the videotape for, right? They might have a buyer broker agreement for one property or two properties. And the reason that you want to know that is that if I'm entering a buyer broker agreement with a client and they have an exclusion, basically that would be an exclusion on these two other properties with that other agent, I would want to know about it. And so I'm going to ask my buyer that I'm working with, have you signed any other buyer broker agreements with any brokers? What are the terms? I need to understand that so that I don't put you in a position where you owe 2 commissions. Is that fair? And they're going to say yes. So I'm going to fill that box out. The next item in here is the property to be acquired. There's some pros and cons about, how you fill this out. And I wanted you guys to understand this is that you want it to be open-ended enough that you don't, they don't buy, in just outside of, don't be so specific in here that you get yourself into trouble. You do a whole bunch of work for you and they find it, 2 blocks outside of Big Bear Lake in Big Bear City. And all of a sudden now you're in trouble, because they're buying outside the zip code that you put in here. So for the example of, what I'm sharing with you, I put all of the zip codes that are in Big Bear Valley. And then I put neighborhoods and price range to be determined by the buyer client. They may say, that they don't want to spend over 500,000. I think I would be a little bit careful about putting a specific price in here, because what happens most of the time is we show people houses in the price range that their wish list was. And they go out and they say, this is a bunch of garbage that you're showing me for 250,000. I'm going to have to spend more money. And they buy something for 500,000. Do I want to have a written buyer broker compensation agreement that is not valid because they go into a higher price range? So I'm suggesting that you go as wide as you can with the parameters so you don't get yourself in trouble. Ed's got a question.
I do, Mark. If you're going to use the zip code, then aren't you telling the buyer that everything in our valley, you're now going to have to use me because you're signing an agreement for the whole area when you use the zip codes?
Well, okay, so when you're working with a buyer now, what areas do you service? If somebody says, I want to buy.
I understand that, Mark, but if we all have clients that have used another broker to go look at a house, if they like that other house and they had an address on it, but I'm using the same zip code, does that make it so that they have to work with me because I've used the whole zip code?
Well, if there's a conflict, you're gonna talk about it. Okay, so that's why we have no pre-existing
Mhm.
buyer representation or compensation
Gotcha.
agreement except. So if somebody has shown let's say that they say, you know, we really want to work with you and we're going to buy somewhere in Big Bear. Great. I put all of the zip codes in because that's the area that I'm working, right? And they
Right.
go, I have this buyer broker agreement that I signed with a Zillow agent, you know, and they showed me this house over on London Lane, which is in the 92314 area code. Well, if they're already on that one, I mean, how long is it? You know, how long is the agreement and different things like that? And I'm going to exclude that property. That's one that I don't want to put the client in the position of owing two, you know, two commissions.
Gotcha.
That makes
Okay.
sense?
Yep.
Okay. Now, again, you know, this is, you know, it's important to understand how this works because there are other options here. You may have somebody that says, you know, Mark, I like you, but I don't want to be open-ended to every single property. I may find something on my own, or I may have another broker that reaches out to me with something. So I don't want to be stuck with you, you know, without some limit. I want to put some limit. Well, there are some abilities to do that. Let's say, for example, that they say, well, you know, I want you to represent me, but I've got 5 properties here I want you to show me. Well, you can check this. You can leave this blank. You don't have to put this in here. You can check the B box that says the following specified properties only and list the properties. Or, you know, they might have 30 properties or 10 properties, and you can say the properties identified on the attached list. So I may have an agreement that lasts for a year that includes only 10 properties on an attached list. So it's important to understand what you're filling out here so that you're covering your bases, you're protecting your interest as well as honoring what the client's actual wish is. Obviously, let me finish. Obviously, what we want, you know, obviously what we want is to have somebody that is so enthralled with our service that any property that they purchase, they're going to purchase it from us. So if that's not the case, then we use some of these other methods to make that possible. So somebody had a question. I didn't see who it was.
It's me, Kenita.
Oh, and it's me. We'll take turns, Kenita.
Okay.
Oh, okay. I was just wondering, wouldn't it be easier just to put the percentage amount in there or a fixed amount with your listing agreement? So the seller knows and kind of base it on maybe not their projected price, but what you know it's going to kind of sell for?
Well, you know, we're right now we're going over the buyer representation agreement, and I understand.
Right, but let's say
You're
you put in there at like 3% for the buyer's representation, regardless of what the price of the house turns out to be. Because like you said, sometimes they start at 350 and end up at 550. Could you just put a percent in there instead of a fixed amount?
Well, right now we're talking about identifying where the property is located. The compensation is what we're going to talk about next.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
maybe you can hit on that when we get there.
Will. Okay.
Thanks.
Well, okay.
Mark,
Let Bill, let Melissa go.
Sorry, Bill, I'll be fast. So Mark, we can maybe talk about it at some point later in the presentation, but I did have a question about how Zillow is starting to market this 7-day touring agreement, like this free 7-day tour thing. And I feel like once we start putting this agreement in front of our buyers, I don't know if they may have questions about that. Like, you know, should I go with this Zillow offer? Because then I mean, I feel like people are still going to have to sign something, right? Like, I don't know how they're putting that out there, like somebody's going to get a deal, or it's just kind of something that I've actually seen repeatedly marketed over the last couple of weeks. And I just didn't know if you had seen that before.
Yeah. So I have not seen the agreement that Zillow is asking. And so for those that are not familiar with what Zillow is doing, Zillow is really competing with real estate brokers. I mean, they have our data, they have properties, and they have, you know, preferred agents, you know, that are paying them some way or another. And so what they're offering is a 7-day buyer broker agreement or a tour, they're calling it a touring agreement. I had not heard the phrase that Melissa used, which was that you get a free 7-day touring agreement. The free 7-day touring agreement probably isn't really free. Well, I mean, you're not writing a check when they sign it. I mean, so it's free from that standpoint. But the buyer broker agreement that we're talking about here, we're not going to ask anybody to write a check either. This may be a test on Zillow's part because currently, at least through August 17th, the buyer broker fee is being offered through the MLS. So there's no risk. There's no risk in saying, we're not going to ask you to compensate us because they know the seller's going to compensate us through August 17th. So it will not be free, and it will not be for zero commission paid for by the buyer after August 17th. I can guarantee you that, because no agent is going to sign that agreement, saying, I'll show you property for the next 7 days for free. They're not going to do that. Make sense? Okay. Bill?
In paragraph 3 there, is there a place to exclude properties?
I don't see it in paragraph three, but I would probably do that up here where this is, where the pre-existing buyer representation and compensation agreements are. I mean, can you give me an example of why you would exclude a property?
Okay, I'm working with the buyer and he says, I've already seen 123 Any Street. I like it. So I'll sign with anything else besides that one because I'm going to pursue that one on my own.
So how did they see 123 Any Street? Do you know?
No.
Okay. I would probably ask them the question, was that under a buyer broker agreement with another agent? Because then you can fill that out in here. If, in the example that, let's say that it's a for sale by owner and there's no broker involved with it, I guess that's possible. They could say, I found a for sale by owner on my own. I want to exclude that. They may say, my brother-in-law has a house in Moonridge. I may want to buy that. So I want to exclude that because it's direct. I think what I would
We can put it in 11. Item 11.
which is exclusions down at the bottom.
No,
I
it's
mean,
just other terms, but that's the only place you could put some exclusions.
yeah, you could do that. Yeah. So, and so it's important to understand how the contract works because you can complete it so that it does what you're intending for it to do, what you're intending for it to do. So let's talk about the compensation. The compensation to the broker is, this is probably the tough one for a lot of people, when they say, well, what's different? We've never, up until now, we've never told a buyer, you're going to have to pay me $25,000 for this $1 million house you're buying. We've never had to say that. We've never said to a buyer, hey, you're going to have to pay me $15,000 for this $500,000 house that you're buying. We've never been forced to do that. What we've always said is, don't worry about that. The seller is paying for it, right? Don't worry about that. The seller is paying for that. We are going to have this conversation now. And I don't know what script that all of you are going to use, but basically what I'm going to say is that, quality, knowledgeable, experienced representation, the customary rate is 2.5% or 3%. And, they're negotiable by law, but my services are 2.5%. The good news is that unless you want to write the check for me, we can negotiate to have the seller pay it the same way that it's been done for the last 40 years. Is that okay with you? And I think that script is probably fine. Most of them are going to say, yeah, that's fine with me. And I think that's going to be the end of the discussion. We're caught up in the 5% or the 10% of the conversations that are going to be rougher than that. 90% of them, they're going to say, yeah, that's fine. Don't worry about it. I'll go ahead and sign it. They're not going to have the ability to go to some other agent to show them property without signing this agreement. So that's one of the positive changes about this, is that everybody's going to have to do it. So whatever you agree to goes in this box. Go ahead, Maureen.
So if you tell them, this is the percentage that I'm going to be getting paid, but don't worry about it, we're gonna negotiate it to have the seller pay. And what if they enter into a property that the seller won't pay?
Well, okay, so this is again is probably the 90%, 90% of the time we don't have that conversation, maybe even 95% of the time we don't have that conversation. But it will happen at some point. And so,
So if they ask us that question,
yeah, so well, I mean, there's a couple of different things, usually usually a seller that is not willing to do what is the norm is a problem seller. And I can understand that you really want a house with a problem seller, and that doesn't happen very often. We would have several options at that point. We can renegotiate our deal at the time, and raise the price to cover cover the amount. So there's options. I mean, one of the phrases that I've used with clients, particularly over the last 10 years or so, is that, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I have solved thousands of problems before in real estate. I don't know what problems we're going to have in our transaction, but I've probably already solved them before. And I don't want to waste your time arguing about, or telling you what we're going to do about that problem, because I don't know what problems we're going to encounter in your transaction or what challenges that we're going to encounter. But I can assure you that I have the experience, and the creativity to solve the problem going forward. Are you comfortable with that? And, and we can do that. I mean, I don't want to solve a problem that we don't have. And I'm not looking for problems. So let's go back into this. So we can put in 2.5%. This and with the dollar might be a transaction fee or a transaction coordinator fee. You can put in a flat fee here of, $5,000, $10,000. You could put in, you could probably put in, well, this last one here, it says to the compensation schedule attached. I mean, I think there are going to be some agents that are charging an hourly wage and a retainer fee. I mean, I don't know what that looks like yet, but this allows you to do a percentage, a flat fee, or to write whatever contract terms that you want, and that's pretty open-ended.
I have a question on that.
Okay.
So 2 things. One is that my understanding was that the buyer's agent cannot be paid more than what is pre-negotiated in this. So if you put 2.5%, but the seller was agreeing to pay 3%, too bad. So wouldn't it be better to always put 3%, and then we can, and I don't know how, negotiate out and tell the buyer, oh, by the way, they only offer 2.5%, and I'm going to accept 2.5%.
Okay. You can do it however, whatever business practice that you want, Tanya. That does make sense. I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but it down here, it says if third-party payments received exceed buyer's obligation, the excess amount shall be paid to the broker. So if you don't check this, if a third-party payment received exceeds the buyer's obligation, the excess amount shall be paid to the broker. That's in the form that we have now. It hasn't been changed yet. That may be changed at some time, but you have the option of keeping the extra 0.5% right now, or crediting it back to the buyer, or you could say we'll split it 50-50. It's up to you. I mean, you have that option.
Okay. I was pretty much under the understanding that no, you didn't, that whatever was predetermined in that BBA, that you couldn't go. So like I said, 2.5% to 3%, you couldn't just say, oh, good, I'll take 3. Okay. My second question is, if can you, as an agent, you know how a lot of times we call an agent and say, my buyer's really super interested in this property and they're going to be making an offer. Can you tell me what you are offering for compensation?
Yeah.
We can.
That would be very, very appropriate. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, if a seller, if a seller is offering compensation to a buyer broker agreement after August 17th, or the listing broker is willing to share a portion of their commission with the buyer's broker after August 17th, it has to be communicated somehow, some way. but it can't be done through the MLS. So, you know, an email, a phone call, a text, you know, whatever, whatever. But to answer your question directly, you know, as of the buyer broker agreement today, there's no requirement that says you can't make 3% if your buyer broker fee is 2.5 on here. Because it says real clearly here is that you can do other things with it. It can go to the broker, it can go back to the buyer, you know. So if you have a 2.5% fee in your buyer broker agreement and the seller offers 3, you fill out this paragraph down here, however you and your client agree to move forward. Okay. So I think we talked about the options there. So I think what's really important about going through some of this is there's some meat in these details in here that I want you guys to be aware of. This paragraph B here, buyers or brokers' right to compensation. Brokers shall be entitled to compensation specified in paragraph 4A if during the representation period or any extension thereof buyer enters into an agreement to purchase, lease, or otherwise acquire any property described in paragraph 3. That's why you want to make sure this is good. And the seller thereof completes the transaction or is prevented from doing so by default of buyer as follows. That's really, really an important change. That's really, really an important change. Because what that's saying is that if they've agreed to pay me 2.5% and they enter into an agreement with a seller and the buyer defaults, technically, by the way that this contract works, the buyer still owes me the 2.5%. It's just like a listing agreement when you have a 6% commission, you know, in your listing agreement and you have a ready, willing, and able buyer under contract that wants to close and the seller breaches the deal, you can sue the seller for the 6% commission by law. Doesn't happen a lot. But what this is saying here is that once you have found a ready, willing, and able seller that has entered into a contract with your buyer, it doesn't have to close in order for you to earn the commission. If the buyer breaches their agreement, you're entitled to the fee. I think that's an important distinction. Not that we're going to use it very often. It's probably, you know, 1 out of 10,000 deals that would happen. The next paragraph is important. Broker involvement. It's important that you know what this broker involvement is. It's basically non-exclusive representation. It means you can have a price in here. It means that you can have the right zip codes in here. You can have all of this information in here, right? You can have 2.5%. But if you're not involved in locating the property for the buyer, then you are not entitled to compensation. So this is asking a really important question. You know, well, what is broker involvement? Broker involvement means any of the following, any of them. Buyer physically entered and was shown the property by broker. That's broker involvement. Broker showed the property to the buyer virtually. That's broker involvement. Broker submitted to seller a signed written offer from the buyer to acquire, lease, exchange, or obtain an option on the property. Okay, writing an offer, that's involved. The property was introduced to buyer by broker or one for which broker acted on buyer's behalf. This is important. However, merely sending buyer a list of properties shall not be deemed broker involvement without documented action on part of the broker analyzing the property for the buyer specifically. This used to happen many years ago, is that buyers would come in and they'd say, you know, I'm looking for a lot in Moonridge. And I still remember the phrase, map them. I mapped them. Anybody ever heard that phrase? I mapped them. They gave them a map and they gave them a list of properties and said, go drive by, and if there's anything you want to see, come back and talk to me. That was the level of service that a lot of agents were providing, 15, 20 years ago, particularly about lots. And I still remember that phrase, map them. That's not broker involvement. And if you were to do that, it would not entitle you to compensation under this.
I have a question, Mark.
Okay.
Sorry, I never know when to interject. How many times have we shown property for other agents or felt like we got our arm twisted to help an agent who couldn't come up here to show their buyer. But if we have to have one of these signed when we're showing buyers, what if they're not our buyer? What if they're somebody else's buyer?
Well, there is a, so let me see if I understand. So you're on a team and and I'm on a team. So if, for example, you have a buyer broker agreement with, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and you're out of the office on Sunday afternoon, and Ally is in, and Ally goes and shows them the property, and then they go write it with their brother-in-law down the hill. Is that the example that you're?
Yes, so something like that, and it's funny that you said Ally, because we both just had this situation where.
Yeah, that's what I was just saying. Yeah.
You have a listing, and then, you have a buyer that's wants to see it, who is ready to write it, but their agent is a sister or whatever her situation was, that's claiming they can't make it to Big Bear. And, you're motivated to sell the property for your seller, but you can't get the buyer's agent to show up to show them the property, but they're desperate to get their buyer in the property.
Yeah. I think under that circumstance, you would show the property representing your seller out of service to them. And you would not be compensated by the other agent or by the buyer unless
Well,
you're
of
able to
course.
negotiate it. Yeah.
I just mean, so you can show buyers without having something signed for every single buyer that you show. That's kind of what I was, the one question.
Yeah, and that was, that was the point of the NAR legal brief that's going to be sent out to you, is that NAR legal counsel, made it clear is that a buyer broker agreement is not required if you're not working with the buyer. So if Mr. and Mrs. Smith are working with their sister-in-law from San Luis Obispo and they want to see your listing, you're not working with the buyer, you're working with your seller, and you are accommodating your seller's interest by allowing another less than available agent.
Yes,
they're in
okay.
their
So
client.
that makes sense. Yes.
Okay.
Mark, but then would we want to ask that buyer's agent for a copy of their buyer broker agreement with their buyer?
I suppose you could. Yeah, I suppose you could ask that. Yeah.
I think we
yeah.
should. We should
Yeah.
make
Just
them jump
to-
through as many hoops as possible.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well, actually, that is, if you have an agent that is so unprofessional that they can't show up, at least you can force them to sign a buyer broker agreement with their client. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So I would probably say is that, no, I'm not working with you. But the trigger for a buyer broker agreement is viewing a property. So if I'm not representing you, I need to have the buyer broker agreement for your agent. I think that's a good policy. I like
Yeah,
that.
just a copy of their buyer broker agreement, so they have one.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
know that the buyer is in fact their buyer, their client. Maybe they just said they are.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Yeah, see, that was the price of admission here.
Right.
But
Okay.
doesn't that presume that you're always carrying that copy of paper with you?
Well, you don't have to carry a paper. It's in your phone. Just look it up and send it over.
Yeah, chances are, now Ally and I know this, and this is sort of a little digression, is that almost 99.99999% of people sign their documents electronically today.
Right.
Only time-
Yeah.
only
Until they
time-
sign one document by hand that means the most.
The only time they sign a buyer broker agreement is when they backdate it to get themselves out of a lawsuit or an arbitration. So anybody that's legitimately signed a buyer broker agreement is probably going to have access through their phone. So that makes a lot of sense. Let's move on because we have some more important ground to cover. So so this broker involvement, that's non-exclusive representation. Now, that might be, that's the way that it's been, when we haven't used a buyer broker agreement, we've had non-exclusive representation. You could work with somebody for 3 weeks and they go buy from somebody else, and you would really have not too much to hold them accountable to. They could say they got mad at you and decided they weren't going to work with you anymore, and so they just move on. Okay. So this is not necessarily that big of a change from, from the way that we worked before, because all of our representation is pretty much non-exclusive. They would say buyers are liars and sellers are worse. Well, having a contract is going to change that. I like this box a lot better. This is what I'm going to be shooting for as often as possible, is when you have a really good relationship with a client, what you really want is to have exclusive representation. And this paragraph says, hey, this agreement is exclusive. It doesn't matter to me whether, you wake up on the wrong side of the bed tomorrow. If you buy in those zip codes in the price range that we've identified, I get paid. That's really what I want. All of us, when we're working with a seller, use exclusive listing agreements. We don't do open listings very often. I mean, that's very, very rare. And so, the question would be, why would a buyer be willing to sign an exclusive buyer representation agreement with you? And I would answer is that, the quality of your presentation, the quality of the service that you provide, basically your professionalism, and the work that you're going to provide on their behalf might be enough to get them to say, you know what, you're going to work hard for me. I will make sure that I buy from you. And so some things that you can offer to do is to, find, off-market properties that fit their needs. If you're an active, hardworking agent that, is willing to go the extra mile for sale by owners and old expireds and things that are in your farm, that might be worth it for them, or that might be the tool that you get them to sign an exclusive agreement with you. Okay. The next paragraph.
Sorry, Mark, really quick on that. I'm sorry, it's Allie. Hey, do you think that it would be worth it to maybe, because it feels, people come up here and they don't know us. Like when they're working with their agent down the hill, they probably worked with them before. So you present to them and, hope that they want to go with you. But in the event that they're kind of like, I don't really want to commit. Do you think giving them the option, like, hey, we can sign it per tour? Like you would do a new one each tour and have the specific properties on each one so they don't feel so like strong-armed into something?
Well, I think, so here's what's different about working with a buyer and working with a seller. Sellers, there's a lot of prep work before they sign a listing agreement. They usually know who you are and what you're about. By the time you do a listing presentation, you sit down and you talk with them for an hour or two, or, there's a lot of involvement with the seller prior to them agreeing to sign a listing agreement with you that's exclusive for 90 days or 6 months. There's also the expectation that you're going to be spending money on their behalf, in marketing their property and doing other things. So there's a little bit difference in the relationship. When you get a buyer, exactly what you just said is that, you don't have days, weeks, or even hours sometimes before they want to go out and look at property. In fact, Tim Wood would say, get them in the car. Know your inventory, get them in the car in 15 minutes. I mean, they've been on their butts in their car for 2.5 hours coming to Big Bear. Don't sit in the office and talk their ear off, talk them to death. Get them in the car and talk to them while you're in the car. So because we have to do a buyer representation agreement before we show property, maybe the best protocol would be to have them sign an agreement that says, you're required to pay me if you buy any of these properties in the next 90 days. And,
okay, yeah, that was kind of my thought. Just initially, and then you'd say, hey, by the next tour, if you feel like you want to just commit to me and we don't have to do this every time we tour, then probably at that point they might be a little bit more willing. I don't know. I'm just thinking more of people being wary of wanting to just go ahead and commit in the first, especially in the first conversation, if they are the Zillow call that calls and wants to see property that weekend. So
Well,
just thinking of more gentler ways to present it.
The other thing about this whole thing is they're going to sign one with someone, either whether it's me, you, or somebody else. They've got to sign one. And
no, I know, but if there's a way to say,
the presentation to them is, this is a new requirement. So
well, no, of course, yes, but to say like, hey, I know that you don't know me that well. Like, this is my presentation. This is what I can do for you. If this all works out, we can sign something that commits me to you regardless of the property. But if you feel more comfortable, we can just start off by doing you know, by property and each time. I'm just wondering if buyers are going to be like, I don't want to sign that. Like, I don't know you, you know, so if there's the conversation that it's, hey, you can sign this first, and then if you want to sign the other one later, just because I feel like there'll be a lot of agents that'll be like, hey, sign this.
Well,
I don't know.
I think that's why we've been talking about showing your value.
Oh,
and
yeah, of
preparing-
course.
And preparing
Yeah.
something that they can.
Oh,
look at,
absolutely.
Maybe even sending it to, emailing it to them before they come up.
Oh, yeah,
Hey,
for
this
sure.
is who
And I kind of
am,
already do
so
that, but yeah.
They'll be much
But-
more prepared. I know, Allie,
Allie, you're right though, because they're already scared rabbits and they're already tell you that they're looking 6 months down the road, or,
Yeah, and I'm not
every lead that walks in the office is already, they would rather hammer on that thing outside the office at the village than come in and talk to somebody.
well, I
So
have a
absolutely.
question.
They're already apprehensive and nervous. And if you
So-
say, okay, here's a list of properties, let's go look at them, sign this piece of paper, they're like, I'll go to the next agents.
What
But there's-
about?
Well,
Well, they
Okay,
don't
Danny.
go, it's all, okay, so but I don't want to go, go
No.
too far out on this.
I just
if
have one
that-
question.
Well, yeah, so this, the important thing to recall here is that we have to build a relationship of trust with the clients. And they will have to sign an agreement before they tour property with someone. So coming up with a sales pitch or a way to get them to agree to work. I mean, if they want to look at property, they're going to have to sign a buyer broker agreement. And so what Allie is saying is that, hey, let's date today. Let's date today. This buyer broker agreement is, we're going to date today with these 7 properties that you're looking at. And if our professional relationship gets to where you're comfortable with it, confident and comfortable with my professionalism, and you want to work with me exclusively, we can talk about that at the next time. And I think that's a great approach. That's a great
So, I totally agree with Ally, and I think that everybody should have a good presentation. My question is just on the back end. So what if you have a buyer that reaches out that's like, hey, I signed this buyer broker agreement, but I don't like my agent, and they got me into this, 180-day agreement, and I don't want to continue to look at properties with them. Is there a cancellation, like on a listing agreement cancellation? I mean, how locked in are these buyers?
Okay, well, that's perfect, because that's where we're going into. Okay, so we
Oh.
talked about non-exclusive, and we talked about exclusive, which is what I really want. I really want to, to have a married client to me. The cancellation of the buyer representation agreement, it goes in here. Either the buyer or the broker may cancel this agreement by giving written notice to the other. This agreement shall be terminated if paragraph 4B1 applies. 4B1, where it's the buyer, the non-involvement, this is the non-exclusive. If 4B1 applies upon receipt of this notice. So if you are non-exclusive and you send them notice, it's over. If paragraph 4B applies, which is the exclusive representation right here, if this one applies, then you get 30 days of grace period. So they can't cancel you. If you have exclusive representation, they can't cancel you for 30 days. This one, they can cancel you with notice. There is a box down here that says, nuh-uh, it doesn't matter what we've checked. Neither party shall have the right to cancel this agreement. I don't know how many people would be willing or unwilling to sign that one, but obviously we would prefer that somebody can't cancel us, but what if we want to cancel them? So here's your cancellation clause. And Melissa, so it really depends on what other people do with their agreement, whether that client will be able to get out of it or not. Make sense? I think the one, the example that Allie is giving, about the, the dating buyer broker agreement is probably going to be broker involvement. It's going to be limited to the properties that I show you today, which means that they can cancel you, immediately. Okay. So let's talk about a couple of other things here that are not super, not super important.
Well,
Accounting.
Mark, one other thought I had.
Yep.
It's kind of like the pandemic showing, paperwork that we had to do. It's the same thing. You had to,
The PED.
Yeah, that's it. You had to list the properties you were gonna show, and you had to do a lot more work than this.
Yeah, we're gonna see a lot of buyer broker agreements getting signed on the hood of cars. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, so accounting for payments but to brokers by others. This goes to Melissa's question earlier. You know, if the third party payment exceeds the 2.5% or whatever the buyer's obligation, what happens with it? The excess amount shall be paid to the broker is the boilerplate here, or credited back to the buyer is that option. This may change after August 17th, but right now this is the one that we have.
I don't
Um,
want to do the credit to buyer, so I'm not gonna check that box.
Yeah, so you don't have to, okay? Authorization to include commission and offer. This says that the buyer authorizes you as the buyer's broker to include the term in the buyer's obligating the seller to pay the broker directly through escrow. This is important, and it's going to be the next form that we go to, okay? So this sort of leads into the seller to pay the buyer's broker fee that we're going to talk about next. This additional broker right to compensation is similar to a listing agreement that adds 30 days, 90 days, 60 days or something. You know, the example that we use on a listing agreement, or the principle that we talk about a lot, is that, you know, hey, I find you a ready, willing, and able buyer for your $1 million property. The only problem is they want to pay you $900,000. And the only thing between them buying the property and you selling it to them is my commission. And so the listing expires, and, you know, 5 days after the listing expires, the buyer goes and buys the property directly from the seller and they don't pay you. That happens sometimes. Well, this paragraph in here is protection for a buyer under the same circumstances. You could be representing a buyer that says, hey, I'm willing to spend $500,000 for the house, but I'm not willing to pay $515,000 for the house, which is what the seller wants in order to pay the $15,000 fee that I owe you. And so they let the agreement cancel, or they let it expire, and they go directly to the seller and say, well, now my broker doesn't have to get paid because our agreement is over. Again, this is probably 1 out of every 10,000 opportunities, but that paragraph is in there to protect you from an unscrupulous buyer and seller that try to do that to you. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, good. Disclosure of anticipated payments to brokers. Basically, this is asking you for transparency so that you communicate to your buyer that says, hey, you know, of the 5 people on our list, you know, this seller's paying 3%, this one's offering 2.5%, this one's offering 2%, this one's offering, you know, 2.5%. Our agreement is 2.5%. So we only have a problem on one. That doesn't mean that you can't make an offer on the one and ask for 2.5%, but that's what they're offering, if that makes sense. So they're asking you prior to write an offer to tell the client how much that you're being offered. Okay. This is prior to writing the offer. If you check this box, it says prior to showing them the property. Disclose to the buyer the amount of compensation that you're expecting to receive from the seller or the seller's agent. Okay. Broker independently or through escrow will disclose the final compensation broker receives from anyone other than buyer, meaning basically you can't receive money from somebody and not tell your client. Okay. This last one's scary. Buyer is responsible for payment of compensation if a third party does not pay as anticipated. I can't imagine that happening, but let's say that you go into escrow and on day 30, on the day of closing, the seller calls up escrow and says, don't pay the listing broker, or don't pay the selling broker his fee. The escrow officer can't pay me because they've been instructed by a principal not to do it. Well, under that case, I probably would have a contractual argument with the seller because of all the things that they've signed up to that point. But ultimately, what this is saying is the buyer's responsible. If I can't collect my fee from the seller in that circumstances, the buyer would be responsible for paying it. Okay, so that's not so
And in
scary.
that case, we can tell them we'll negotiate
Yeah,
a
yeah.
different kind of payment.
Yeah, you know, and that goes back to that, you know, script that I gave you earlier, Maureen, is that, you know, I've solved 1,000 problems, you know, over the last 40 years. I don't know what we're going to encounter, but I'm pretty creative and I can solve a problem like that if it comes up. The rest of this stuff is pretty much boilerplate. You know, timing is going to be at closing or upon breach. Payment's going to be through escrow. Pre-existing buyer representation and compensation agreement. If a buyer acquires a property during the time period, buyer is obligated to compensate another broker identified in that second paragraph. Broker is neither entitled to compensation under this agreement nor obligated to represent buyer in such a transaction. So that basically says, you know, I could work with somebody for, you know, a week or a month. And if they end up buying a property that they have a contract with another broker, that I have to step out of it and they go back to the other broker. That's what that's saying.
So can they just lie about it, or they're signing a thing saying there isn't one?
Well, if they're,
Yeah, so that's, if they sign this with me, they're saying there is no pre-existing.
that's exactly it. And if they sign and say that there's no other agreement and there is, now they're really in trouble because they got 2 binding contracts. Which
Got
is
it.
a problem that we don't want to have to solve, but we can. The rest of this stuff is all boilerplate stuff that we see in listing agreements and purchase agreements. There's really nothing in here that is new. It has the entity, you know, buyers. So if you're buying as a trust and that kind of stuff, that information is in there as well. So I know we've been talking about it for a long time. The next form is a little shorter. So let me.
Hey, Mark, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
And maybe this isn't the right time, but I keep looking at all of our documents, and I studied the broker's exam like 6 months ago and just didn't go forward with it. Can you explain to me the difference between a broker and a realtor? Because I'm not a broker. And I know they don't pay me. I know they pay RE/MAX. So where does it say in any paperwork how that?
Yeah, so a real estate licensee, a salesperson is a entry-level license status by the Department of Real Estate. So when you get your real estate license, you start out as a real estate associate or a licensee. If you get additional education and take additional classes and take another test, you get a broker's license, which means that you are more educated and have more responsibility. You're allowed to have salespeople work under your supervision when you're a broker. As a licensee, you must have a supervising broker. The term realtor that you're using means that you are a member of the National Association of Realtors, California Association of Realtors, and the local association. If you are you don't have to be a realtor to be a broker, or you don't have to be a broker and be a realtor. I mean, realtor is a voluntary association to join. Does that make sense? So it has nothing to do with your license status. You're muted, Ed. Ed, you're muted.
It does make sense to me, but and we've been doing it for a long time. It's just all of the documentation says broker, and none of us are brokers other than you.
Well, because I'm your supervising broker, I'm responsible for what you do.
So shouldn't one of these documents say or broker's licensee?
No. When you are signing a document, you are a subagent of me. So I'm trusting all of you not to put my license at risk by doing anything really dumb.
So it's
Well-
just an automatic thing then that everybody seems to understand, yet it's not written anywhere for the buyer's agent or the buyer to understand.
Yeah, the legal distinction, Ed, is when you sign a contract, I'm signing the contract. You're signing it on my behalf as a subagent. And I bear the responsibility for supervising you, and my responsibility is greater than yours.
Okay.
So everybody on this call, do not mess up. Okay. So let's move on to the next form, which is the seller payment to buyer's broker. This should be, you know, and after August 17th, I mean, this is if the seller is going to be paying the buyer broker fee, this is a form that's going to be included in every package that, you know, goes to escrow and everybody signs. So I really think this is a great, a great document. It's incorporated into the purchase agreement dated such and such a date. It has a property, it's got the buyer and seller, so it identifies the parties. You only use this form if the buyer and buyer's agent have already entered into a buyer representation agreement. So that last document that we had, you have to have one to show property. You have to have one if you're working with a buyer and you're doing ministerial acts, and writing a purchase contract for a buyer is working with the buyer and doing a ministerial act. So you should have a buyer broker agreement in place. So this should be, if you're writing an offer, this should be done. It says, and buyer has an obligation to pay buyer's broker's compensation pursuant to the agreement. So if you have a buyer broker agreement that there's no obligation for them to pay you, if you're working pro bono, if you're working for free, you wouldn't have to do this. Okay, you wouldn't have to do this. But if you have an agreement, there's a fee in there, let's say for the sake of argument, it's 3%. And the buyer is asking the seller to pay the buyer's broker all or a portion of the balance due buyer's broker under the representation agreement, this amount shall be entered into paragraph 3.
Why does it say MLS? I thought we aren't going to be able to offer it in the MLS.
Because this form was created prior to August 17th.
So it'll probably change.
They will remove the MLS from that.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was one of the notes that I had written down to share with you. Okay. Seller may accept, reject, or counter this term or any other term in the buyer's offer. Okay. So the big question that a lot of times people will say, well, what if the seller doesn't want to pay the buyer broker fee? Well, what happens when we are negotiating an offer for a buyer that needs their closing costs financed? What do? We raise the price in order to cover the 3% loan fees, right? And so and a smart listing agent goes to the seller and says, it doesn't matter whether you get 100,000 and don't pay the fees, or you pay, or they buy it for 103,000 and you pay $3,000 worth of fees. The net proceeds are the same to you. With this buyer, you can adjust the sales price to cover the fee. So a lot of times, one of the big objections that I'm hearing from people is this fear is that, well, sellers don't want to pay it. And well, if the buyer, wants to buy the house and they're willing to pay 103,000 so that they don't have to write a check for $3,000, then they write the offer with 103,000 and have the seller pay it. That makes sense. It's exactly the same when buyer's closing cost.
Are the lenders going to understand that there's a added amount to cover the compensation, and it doesn't have to, because will we get into appraisal issues? Does it have to be the final number that it has to appraise at that includes the compensation, or do they deduct the compensation for the value? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, the recent rule that came out, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac had agreed to allow buyer broker compensation to be incorporated into the sales price in addition to their limit for closing cost.
But
So-
it doesn't necessarily have to appraise at that higher number.
Has to raise its sales price.
Right. So sales price plus the commission, the on the loan.
Sales price.
Yeah.
No, Maureen, it will have to appraise, just like when you add value for closing costs, it has to include, the appraisal has to cover that.
Well, that's exactly my question.
Yeah,
Is
unless you write it
If
differently.
the appraisal has to go to that very top number with all the additions on it, we're gonna have appraisal issues.
We don't have appraisal issues now with 3% being paid on commissions.
But if we have,
Well, and if it
but
doesn't.
that's not added on to the purchase price.
Right, but if it,
now.
usually if it doesn't appraise with the 3%, we have to reduce the price back down. And then what you can do is go back to the lender, have them rework the loan and have them add that 3% as commissions. And I think it's a restructuring.
Yeah, Michelle Town has actually given some advice on that.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
So, yeah, so there's a way to move the numbers around when you understand the structure of the offer. So let's go into this. Okay, so you already have a buyer broker agreement. There's an obligation for the buyer to pay you. and the buyer wants the seller to pay the fee, okay? Again, we've got, commissions are not fixed by law, and the seller doesn't have to agree to it. They can say, no, I'm not going to pay that fee. Well, okay, well, what price will you take if you pay the fee? The buyer's representation agreement with compensation. Buyer has entered into a written agreement to compensate the buyer's broker 3% of the purchase price. Okay, so let's say 3%. Compensation from seller's broker to buyer's broker. As of the date of this seller payment for buyer's broker document is signed by buyer and pursuant to the MLS, that's gonna go away. It won't be through the MLS. It's going to be compensation from seller's broker to buyer's broker. Seller's broker has agreed to pay buyer's broker, let's say it's 2.5%. That leaves 0.5% difference, right? Seller payment to buyer's broker shall not be greater than the amount in paragraph 1 up here, which is 2.5%. So you're actually coming down here and changing it. That makes sense. So what you're asking them to do is, I've got an agreement at 3%. The guy is offering 2%, but I want 3% upon completion of the transaction. And so you're filling this out, and they can counter it out, or you can go back to your buyer and renegotiate and say, they've only offered me 2.5%. I'll accept that. Does that make sense to everybody? With a buyer broker agreement in this form, after August 17th, if you are writing an offer and asking the seller to pay you 2.5% with this form, and you have a buyer broker fee at 2.5%, you're doing exactly the same thing, just having 2 additional forms as we've been currently doing for the last 5 years, because the average commission for the last 5 years has probably been 2.5%. Absolutely no structurally to what it is that we're doing. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. I'm going to go to the last document, which is very, very short, which is a buyer transactional advisory. This is very similar to a seller transaction or a seller's advisory. It basically tells what our obligations are, what the buyer's obligations are, what they can expect from us, what they can't expect from us. I mean, we've had a lot of these documents, available to us over the last, 10, 15, 20 years in relation to sellers. And most people don't really talk about it. I mean, and I think there's a couple of reasons, or there's a couple of shortcomings as to why. Number one, agents are they want the business so bad that they overpromise. They'll promise the world. I mean, this is what the law says you should expect. This is what the standard of practice is. This is what the industry says is normal, is normal behavior. But we tend to overpromise, and we sort of ignore a lot of this stuff. The other thing that I think we failed to really pay any attention to this is that we really don't want to be obligated to any standards, and so we'll do as little as we can in order to get paid. There are some agents that are out there that will do as little as they can to get paid, and so they don't want this. But it's good to read through this and to know what these things are, because you're asking your buyer to sign it, and so you should be able to say, here's what I'm obligated to do, here's what I'm not supposed to do. If there's anything that's important that you want me to do, let's talk about it now. It also talks about allowing dual agency, which still is allowed in California. I don't see any chance that that's going to go away anytime soon. But for example, in Tennessee, there's no dual agency. In Florida, there's no dual agency.
I was in Sacramento last week or 2 weeks ago, and they're talking about removing it.
So there's changes like that. So let me see, there's some questions here that I want to see if I'm missing anything. This okay, right, Tanya? Is that okay? So we have on the buyer representation agreement, does our name go anywhere on the form or just Remax Big Bear? Let me go back up there. At the top of the form, the broker is Remax Big Bear. Real estate broker firm, Remax Big Bear. Buy, you'd put your name in there. I have John Dogood. Could be Sally Dogood, Becky Dogood, Edward Dogood. Okay, anybody can be in here. That's where your name goes, right there. Makes sense? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see how many people are still here. Look at all those black boxes. Lots of people here. So thanks for bearing with me for an hour and 35 minutes of a lot of information. I really want you to understand what's possible, what you can do with this. If you understand how the forms work and you're able to communicate, with your client what their options are, it's important that you know how to fill out the form so it reflects what protects you and, and reflects the agreement that you have with your client. So if you have any questions, I expect some of this stuff is going to change. Some of the forms are going to continue to change. Some of the standards of practice, people are going to try things and it's going to work. And when they try it and it works, other people are going to copy it and adopt it. People are going to try stuff and it won't work. And everybody else say, oh, I wouldn't have thought of that. And I'll never do that. So we're going to go through a little bit of an experimentation, but the truth of the matter right now is nothing has to change except the additional signing of two different documents, which is the buyer broker agreement and the seller to pay it, including it with your purchase agreement, and doing the honor of telling your buyer exactly what it is that you're doing and how you're being paid. It's almost like a Me Too moment for real estate. That's what this is. It's a Me Too moment for real estate, meaning that our clients now that are paying us have to consent to it. And we're worth it. So we're going to have to be able to step up our game and explain to them, why we're worth what we're worth. And we're going to have to execute on the things that we promise them. And I think it's going to improve the industry. It's going to protect us from a lot of unscrupulous agents from outside the area that have been sending up their clients. That's going to go away with this buyer broker thing. So question from Tanya, is the listing agreement going to change? Yes, at least they're going to remove offering compensation through the MLS. That will be gone. I don't know what other changes that they will make, but that will happen. So anybody else with any questions or comments?
So Mark, my thought is, in the past 25 years, every year when we go, and I don't know if we've heard Gov for the whole 25, but when we go to the board meeting and Gov speaks, he goes, well, we've got a few new forms here. It's like nothing has changed in that respect. Every time there's another lawsuit about anything, they add forms. So this is kind of what it reminds me of. Just getting some more forms and have to know how to explain these forms. And we always have had to have permission and authorization for compensation. But now we have to be prepared to explain it. And for the past few years, we've had different ways come up that lenders are working with us and not compensation fees, but concessions that can be paid. That's what you said sums it up, is that we are problem solvers. And when something comes up, we're not going to just throw our hands up and say, oh God, I guess this deal's dead. No, it's just beginning. You get to solve a problem. And that's so fun, to solve the problem and still have it go forward. As you have shared with me many times, you love a challenge and you get excited about figuring it out. So that's all we have to do, is just get excited about figuring it out and how to present it.
Yeah. The class that I would really, this is one of the things that I've been pondering the last couple of years, is the class that I would like to give is the mindset of the problem solver. For those of you that, the people that know their scripts are the best, they know it so well on the inside. They spend the time to develop and to understand how things work, and they create solutions that are innovative and exciting, and they're always constantly trying to improve and to learn how to be ahead of the game. You know, I mean, we have so many examples of that. I mean, there's so many agents that they're not the same. I guess, you know, the way I would sum it up is don't do what somebody tells you to do. Don't come to a class and say, how do I fill this out? Go to a class and learn how the form works. Go to a class and learn how the industry works. And then look at the problems that are in front of you and figure out how to solve that problem, because that's what really puts you at the top of your field. You know, I'm hoping that all of you walk away from this and say, you know, this is my problem that I'm having with it, and here's how I'm going to solve it, and that you share it with other people in the company. And that way, you know, we will be able to not be pushed back by this change, but be pushed forward by this change, you know, because we're thinking, because we're innovating, we're doing those kinds of things. So I appreciate you all coming and listening and participating. And of course, if you have any questions, you know, feel free to reach out. Email or text is best usually, so I can call you back, okay?
Hey, Mark, one question. What about the types of properties that fall outside the 1 to 4 units, such as, you know, when we're selling lots? You think this is going to boil over to that later on?
Well, I mean, it says, you know, it's, you know, the form, you know, the compensation advisory form says it's advisable. And in some cases, it's required. You know, the only requirement right now is residential 1 to 4 units. It's still advisable for vacant land. It's still advisable for commercial. In fact, you know, buyers that are working with commercial brokers usually work under a broker agreement. So I would say just, you know, use it with all of your clients at this point. So I need to look at these. There's a little bit of discussion here. I want to make sure I don't miss any questions in here. Can compensation be offered in the MLS for the type of property that Mary just mentioned, commercial property? I don't know. I will find out. See, I'm learning new stuff. That's what I learned in the first 6 months I was in the business. People would ask me questions and say, I don't know, but I'll find out. Here I am 40 years later. I don't know, but I'll find out. It's a great script to have. Okay. I don't think there's any other questions here. All right. If that's it, I will let you all go.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Happy
all.
birthday, Dana.
Happy birthday, Dana.
Oh,
Happy
thank
birthday.
you.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
That's really